Hilma Carter, welcoming you to the second Benny Carter and Ed Berger concert, which memorializes their work in jazz and their close friendship. We will have music by Eddie Barbash's quartet, some reminiscences from family and friends who knew and loved Benny and Ed, and then some music, a piano and guitar, Sean Mason and Aayushi Karnik. They will be playing Only Trust Your Heart. Next, we hear from Dan Morganstern, who was the director of the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University. He worked very closely with Ed for 30 years, so their relationship produced excellent programs and excellent work of every sort.
I'm Dan Morganstern, and one of the great blessings of my life was to become a friend of Ed Berger. And we worked together at the Institute of Jazz Studies for what seems like a lifetime. And it was beautiful to observe the growing friendship between Ed and Benny Carter, which, of course, as you already know, began with the biography, which was a collaboration between Ed and his father, which is an unusual thing to find father and son collaborating on something like a biography. And just at the time that I got to know Ed, the relationship with Benny was just budding, because Ed was doing most of the research for his father. And this put him into personal contact with Benny. And somehow, rather quickly, their relationship grew into a true friendship. It wasn't strange to me, because the same thing had happened to me. I met Ed for the first time when I became director of the Institute, and there was just the two of us. My title sounded grandiose, but there were just the two of us. And Ed was such a wonderful person, such a remarkable man. And what the two of them had in common was that both of them were absolutely upright people with total integrity, and they both could not bear any kind of dishonesty. And that was something that would instantly turn them off. So they established trust right from the beginning. And I still remember how astonished Ed was when Benny asked him to come to Japan with him as a road manager for a band that Benny had put together. I think it was about 8 pieces, rather distinguished musicians, all of them. And Ed was totally, I remember he said to me, road manager, what? I don't know what to do. Benny said to him, don't worry, you'll figure it out. And of course he did. And as the song goes, it sounds corny, but that was really the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And I was in the lucky position of, observing a lot of it, because the things that they were doing together, I was lucky to be an observer. For instance, Ed became Benny's record producer, and I was at most of the sessions. And Ed, again, had no prior experience of that, but he caught on to it just like that. Ed had a wonderful way of relating to people, and a wonderful way of telling them what he wanted them to do without making them feel that he was giving them instructions. He was, to use a word like tactful, he was very tactful. It was the same way with the researchers that came to the Institute, whatever they were, ranging in age from, very old to very young. But he treated them all equally, and with if they deserved it, with respect. Ed wasn't anybody like Ed. And I was so lucky that late in my life, relatively late period to make true friends, that I met Ed and we became true friends. I miss him almost every day.
Now we have the music of the Eddie Barbash Quartet. Eddie, of course, is playing alto saxophone. He is accompanied by Steve LaSpina on bass. Steve played with Benny a great deal on recordings and engagements. Also Steve Johns on drums. James Chirillo played electric guitar, and he was very close to Joe Wilder and to Remo Palmieri, and was used a lot by Joe Wilder on his work. The last book that Ed wrote was the biography of Joe Wilder. They chose to play Benny Carter titles that are not as well known as some, and I think you will enjoy, if you're not familiar with them, getting acquainted with them. They deserve to be heard more.
Quarter note pickup.
Cool. Good. You rolling, Jeff?
Yep, everything's rolling.
Keep going.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Next, we will hear from the musicians that Benny worked with in his last years. First, Chris Neville, the pianist. Chris was very important to Benny. He worked with Benny on Lincoln Center. He went with us to Thailand and played for the King of Thailand. And he also went on a trip to Germany with us. So he toured with us a great deal. Steve LaSpina on bass also worked with Benny on a number of recordings and performances. Also Steve Johns on drums.
Well, I worked with Benny. Benny came to Boston in 1988, and I was hired to be part of the local rhythm section. And then he returned in 1989, and at the end of the 3-day engagement, he asked me, do I have any recordings of my own? So I sent him a demo, and he liked it. And he called me for a couple of different things. The one that came to fruition was he called to say, I'm making a record with Phil Woods in New York next month. Might you be available on such and such a date? And, I think Phil told it better than me I think it was the further definitions date. Oh, I had an Italian wedding and a funeral. So, of course, so I said I wasn't available. No. But Benny, but Ed, it worked out, and he said, someone named Ed Berger will be in touch with you to go over the details. And that, of course, was the My Man Benny, My Man Phil record. And that was the start. That was the start of a nearly 20-year friendship. I mean, I worked with Ed after that on my 3 recordings. What were there, like 7 or 8 with Benny, the Japan tour, the Thailand tour, and we talked on the phone very, very often too, long, involved conversations. But that's how it started, was because of Benny and that first recording.
My story is kind of interesting because I was listening to a playback of a recording I did of Benny's tune "Only Trust Your Heart," and I was sitting in my music area listening to this playback of the recording, the session I'd just done, and the phone rings, and it's Ed Berger, and he says, "Hello, my name is Ed Berger, and I am calling you to see if you'd be available to do some work with Benny Carter." And I'm like, wow. I says, I was just listening to a playback of a recording I did of one of his tunes. And he said, Benny heard you on the radio and asked me to get in touch with you. And that's how I met Ed. And I spent some time at the Institute, and Ed would always help me with research I was doing. And I was doing some jobs in Princeton where he would actually come and hang out at a couple of gigs. So that's how I was introduced to Ed. And I was like, I almost felt like it was a prank, like somebody was pranking me. Like it just felt like, wow, it was surreal. And, we went on to do all of the gigs that we did with Benny together, So
that was the songbook, the songbook recording?
No, that was before that. Benny was going to be working at, what was the name of the club? It was downstairs. Oh,
the Iridium?
I don't remember.
The Iridium.
Over by Lincoln Center, the hotel across the street.
It was the Iridium.
The Iridium. Yeah, that's where it was.
The old one. Yeah.
The old one, the original one. That was my first gig with Benny.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really actually formed a real close relationship with Ed after working with Benny Carter. We years later, because I was like the youngest. Well, not the youngest. I wouldn't say that. I'm not that much younger. But you got me on the gig, Lauren. I believe, and I think you mentioned to Benny about me, and I remember getting a phone call from Chris Neville's about possibly going to Germany with Benny, because my first gig with Benny was in Germany, I believe. I
That's
flew over
right.
there.
Yeah.
And I remember, what was that festival, Steve? We played that festival with Randy Brecker many years later, but it was
I don't remember the name of the festival. It was
yeah, it was in
beautiful-
Germany, and I remember meeting Benny and being very happy and proud to be asked to do this. And I remember we did a sound check, and then we had dinner. And I remember Benny had just turned 90 years old, and he's sitting there in the restaurant right near the venue we were playing at, and he's sitting there and he's drinking a nice German beer, like right before we're getting ready to go play. I said, man, this guy's got so much spirit. He's so alive. He's 90 years old, and he's just like young. He's acting like he's a young person. I don't think Ed Berger was on that tour, but after that, I started working more regularly with everybody. We did the gig at the Regatta Bar with Phil Woods. That was another gig that we did. We had a couple nights up there. And I met Ed, and he was a great person. He was a very warm person, and but I don't think I really. I just saw him mostly just on the gigs, and we had conversations and stuff like that. But it was like more later that we got closer, and with the Institute of Jazz Studies. We did he actually did my liner notes on my record, family record, and we were very close on the phone all the time. We also restored together Curly Russell's bass, and that's at the Institute of Jazz Studies. And the other thing with Ed, he also helped me with some writing, some CVs for college applications. He's just great with English, really good with with things like that, and also his photography was just.
Oh yeah,
amazing photography, and so I really miss Ed, and we talked a lot on the phone. We got very close, before he passed away, and we almost talked almost like weekly. And also, as a trio, we played Ed Berger's 50th birthday party. I don't know if you remember that.
That's right.
And it seems like like we're way over 50 now, and just to think we played his 50th birthday is amazing. But he was a great, beautiful, warm person, and so wasn't Benny. And I was so proud to be a part of this great group at the end. It was about 2 years I was doing gigs off and on, and I remember playing one of the gigs. There's two gigs that really were special. Was the one that we did at Charlie Parker Festival. We played with Milt Jackson.
Right.
That was the front line with Benny Carter and Milt Jackson. I think somebody has a recording somewhere of that on their Walkman or something. But that was a very special. We went on after Ray Brown, and the other one we did was Ravinia. We played out in Ravinia with Harold Land and Flip Phillips. We did an all-star kind of thing out there. And I can just add one more thing. It's funny. Benny always had these little jokes. He would joke around with me, and one was like, before he goes, Steve, I want to speak to you. It's backstage at Ravinia, big concert. He goes, Steve, when you go out on stage, I want you to go out there and I want you to kick some ass. I want you to go out there and kick ass tonight. So we played the concert. It was really great. Come off the stage, and he says, Steve, I need to talk to you. Come over here. And I'm going like, oh, what did I do? And he goes, when I said kick ass, I didn't mean mine. He had these little, anybody could make up a joke and say something in the beginning and then say it after the concert, the punchline later on. He's just a great guy.
One of the things that Ed used to talk about was how difficult it was to interview Benny and try to get Benny to talk about the past because he was still working on the discography or updating the discography, and there were always loose ends of things, and I mean they were quite close. He would go out to California quite a bit and look over things, but it was it's funny. There's a quote from Ed somewhere in talking about Benny, saying how frustrating it was to interview him, where in saying you could sometimes it felt like it was a struggle to get him to admit that he played the saxophone. But he persevered and was able to do it. And it was, the friendship was reciprocated. I think it was the George Duvivier book, the book that Ed wrote about George Duvivier. It might have been the Joe Wilder book, but no, it had to be the Duvivier book. That because this is a story about Benny. And, you know, Ed was very meticulous with punctuation and language, and editing himself in print. And of course, as Steve mentioned, he would do liner notes for us and fix things. And Ed sent the manuscript to Benny for the final look over. And then Ed called me up a couple of days later. He goes, "You won't believe what happened." He said, "I have the receipts for when I dropped it off and when the time that FedEx delivered it, and when Benny called me. And in this very short window of time, Benny picked up something like 23 errors in the book, and 15 of which were punctuation." It was like things like that. And, you know, the man's over 90 years old. So now if that isn't friendship.
Yeah. My memories of Ed and Benny together mostly come from when we did the songbook. That's what I just remember that, you know, Benny would have a lot of questions, musical questions for us. And Ed would come over and he'd say to me, "You're next." I'm like, "Oh no, I don't want to be next." He's like, "You're next. He's going to ask you next." And sure enough, and I remember, because remember, Chris, how Benny, we were coming up with intros and endings to a lot of
Right.
And Sherman Ferguson was playing drums on it, and Sherman would be saying this, you'd be coming up with this, and I'd be kind of sitting back, and Ed would come over. He says, "You know, you're going to be next." And I'm like, "Well, I don't want to get into it." And sure enough, about 10 minutes later, Benny turns around to me and he says, "All right, you haven't said anything. What do you want to do?" And I'm like, "Oh God," you know. But Ed and Benny, it felt like they were always on like the same wavelength.
Oh,
Ed
yeah.
knew exactly what was going to happen. And, you know, Benny's ears were so sharp, even at 90, man, he didn't want to hear a lot of flat fives, you know, and if I would play a flat five, he'd turn around and look at me, and Ed would just smile. I'm like, okay. So, that was a really special relationship between the two of them. You know, it's like they both were on the same wavelength all the time.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm just really happy to be included in Ed's book about Benny. You know, that makes me very proud, and you know, to have that legacy with everybody here. And you know, I wasn't really around Ed and Benny as much as Steve and Chris were, but they certainly did have a fantastic relationship, and you know, it was a great like family feeling. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Most of my memories have to do with the songbook project, because that was such a big project. And while Ed was always there in the background, I always knew that everything was going to work, because Ed just took care of business. I remember even when we were in LA at the hotel, me having to deal with the bass trunk and the bass. Ed was like, he was always like really laid back about stuff too, but it was done. It was always done, you know. And I knew, as far as logistics and things like that, Ed took care of business, and he was calm, and he always had some real dry humor kind of jokes that he would come up with, and I'm like, really, where'd that come from, Ed? And it was hysterical. Mm-hmm. And that was my experience with Ed. In even when I was working on this paper I was writing, going over to Rutgers, he would find information for me, and he'd come back 20 minutes later. You need anything else? I mean, he was Ed, you know, one of a kind. Kind.
Yeah, Ed was a beautiful guy. My memory of him with Benny, being around Benny and on the gigs that I did, was Ed Berger in camera.
Yeah.
And he always had he always was taking pictures and documenting every move. And some of the photos that I think he used to send me photos. He used to send me like what is it, flicks or whatever it is, the flicks that they send in files. And he would just be very into sending out his new photos that he took of us. And some of them we have are like with Harold Land and, Flip Phillips of Warren Vacher, that gig we did in Virginia. I'd like to get, I know I have them somewhere, but, Ed was a great guy. And one thing when he did these things for me, somehow he didn't want any money for anything that, like, helping me with papers or even writing liner notes. He said, Ed, I'm gonna send you something. What's your address? And he goes, don't send me anything. He didn't want anything. He just wanted to help out. He was such a person that was just always wanting to help you, and if he liked you, he would be really behind you. And I just remember talking to him.
Extraordinary generosity.
Yeah.
will hear from Vincent Pilot of the Jazz Institute at Rutgers University. He will talk about Benny and Ed, and because he was very close to them and worked with them very much for a great number of years and knows them probably better than anyone else.
I've been at the Institute of Jazz Studies for over 40 years, and my first meeting with Ed Berger took place in the 1970s, probably 1975, when he was hired to be the curator to keep the Institute of Jazz Studies open for a couple of days a week until a new executive director could be hired. Chris White was the old director who left, and so we needed a new director. And so Ed came in. I was a work study student, and I had keys, which I immediately gave to him, and we started a friendship at that point, talking about all sorts of things, mostly jazz, of course. And I realized even that early that Ed Berger was a big fan of Benny Carter. And I knew who Benny Carter was because I had a lot of his recordings at home, and I hadn't listened to a lot of them at that point. I mean, just do here and there. But once Ed started talking about him, he piqued my interest in Benny again, and I started listening to some of the recordings, and everything Ed was telling me about Benny was true. I mean, he was fantastic. I mean, let's face it. I mean, one of the greatest alto saxophonists in the history of the music, and not a bad trumpet player. And so, you know, we had that in common, and among other things. And when I was hired at the Institute in 1978 to catalog sound recordings, of course, I renewed my relationship with Ed. And it was during that time, while I was working at the Institute of Jazz Studies, that I got to finally meet Benny Carter. He came to the Institute. Ed arranged it, and he came and sat down, and we talked, and I was in heaven to sit there and talk to this man who I've been idolizing for all those years. And I noticed immediately the relationship between Ed and Benny, the way Ed would treat Benny when he came into the Institute. I mean, Ed was always nice to everybody. He was just a nice guy, but he was especially nice to Benny Carter. I mean, he was offering him food and a place to sit, and you know, can I carry your alto sax? Can I do this? Can I do that? And it was almost comical in a way, the way he was doing it. And in fact, afterwards, I was saying, hey, Berger, what is this, the Benny Carter fawning club? I mean, because he was fawning over Benny, and eventually we made a joke of it between the two of us. Because when we would go to see Benny, he would say, "Okay, it's fawning time," and he would go into fawn mode. And but you know, he was just being Mr. Nice Guy because he was just that way. And Benny didn't seem to mind, although you know, I could tell that you know, Benny wanted to carry his own saxophone. He didn't want Ed doing that and all that, but Ed would let him would do it anyway, and it was okay. It was fun watching the two of them do that. And it was just interesting that their relationship became more than just a friendship in some ways, in that Benny used Ed to be his manager, road manager, when he would go to Japan. And he did it because he obviously realized that Ed Berger was one of those people that got things done. He was very organized, very, very organized. And he just had a way of getting things done, getting things accomplished. And Benny, somebody like that. And Ed did the job and did it well, just like he did at the Institute of Jazz Studies as the associate director. He got things done there too. And he was very efficient, and he just continued that way. And watching the two of them together was always very interesting, because I would often accompany Ed to New York or wherever to see Benny perform. And we would always arrive a little earlier than most people, because Ed always wanted to get a good spot in the club or wherever in order to get pictures. Ed was a very good photographer, excellent photographer. So he always wanted to get there early so we could get a good seat. And that often meant that we got there just as as Benny got there in some cases, or sometimes Ed would actually pick Benny up at the hotel and take him to the club. So we were always early, and so that was something that happened often. And in one instance, when Ed was playing at Carlos One, a club in New York that no longer exists, we got there very early. And Ed, who played trumpet, for those of you who didn't know that, Ed played the trumpet. He wasn't the greatest trumpet player in the world. In fact, I would say that the only person that played trumpet worse than him was, well, everybody. let's back that up. The only person that I would say you can compare him to, I would say, would probably be someone like Leora Henderson or Bunk Johnson before he got his teeth. He just wasn't that good, but he was sincere. I mean, he really took it seriously in some cases, but seriously and not seriously, because he knew he wasn't that good at it, but he kept at it anyway, and it was fun, and we had a good time with it. But watching him in this club talking to Benny about trumpet playing, which I had never seen him and Benny talk about anything like that before, because Benny played trumpet also. So, that just was interesting that he was asking Benny these questions, and somehow the subject of the third valve came up. And if any of you ever seen the film Symphony and Riffs, Benny Carter's documentary, there is a scene in Carlos One where Benny's playing the blues, and at some point he's fingering the third valve, and he's looking. Well, you can't say that he's looking at Ed, but that's who he's looking at, because he's showing Ed that you can do something with that third valve that Ed was saying you really couldn't do anything with. So it's just a little thing that you need to know to understand why Benny's even smiling a little bit. I think he even chuckles a little bit as he's doing it while he's trying to play. And so Ed and I knew what was going on, but I don't think anybody else did in the club. And certainly nobody who's watching the film knew it, but now you do. So there you go.
Next, we will have a photo montage of photographs of the jazz figures by Ed Berger. He was as great a photographer as he was a discographer and writer on jazz subjects. And now we hear from family members, Ed's brothers, Larry and Ken. Both were very instrumental in working on the Benny Carter projects. Both were computer men, and Ken was particularly knowledgeable about recording aspects and was responsible for recording a number of the Benny Carter concerts. And Larry was particularly adept at creating websites, and he created the award-winning Benny Carter website, which seems to be considered to be quite extraordinary.
Yes, it was our father who I think was giving a lecture at a university in the Midwest, and just kind of on a whim almost invited Benny Carter, who he had admired, most of his life, to join him. And he was, he'd never done anything. Benny had never done anything like that, and sort of asked for Morrow's assurance that it would go well, and it did. They hit it off, and then there was kind of a lifelong friendship. My father brought Benny to Princeton for a number of concerts. I think it was 9 total, and he was a visiting lecturer, and our whole family got to know Benny and his wife Hilma that way. And Ed was Benny's his discographer, I think, when he was in college, and then collaborated with my father, or did the second edition of the book. So his biographer, photographer, record producer. They started a record label together, and right-hand man, went on a bunch of tours of Japan as his road manager.
Oh gosh, I wish I hadn't deferred. Now I have to correct all of that. That is pretty much accurate, but I would just add that I think their initial meeting between Morrow and Benny Carter was even more happenstance, because as I recall the story, our father was laid over basically in Los Angeles on a trip, and he had some time to kill, and really on a whim, he looked Benny up in the phone book, because he'd always been a fan of Benny's music, but never met him and didn't really know much about him, on a personal level, but just loved his music forever. So he found him in the phone book and called him up. And it was, as Morrow liked to relate, it was one of those instances where the artistic expression perfectly matched the personality of the artist, and so they hit it off really well. Benny invited him to their house immediately. They got together, and that sort of kicked off this friendship. So then I believe it was at Baldwin Wallace College in Ohio. Morrow had an offer to come and do a lecture on jazz, and he sort of parlayed that into a short artist in residency for Benny with him, and that was the beginning of their, multi-decade association. And I would just add that it sort of became a family obsession. I mean, we were all indoctrinated into Benny's music because it played in our house all the time. But each of us had some kind of role to play in that association professionally, eventually. And Ed, of course, had the biggest one, being the discographer, and then sort of co-author of the initial biography, and of course all those other right-hand man tasks that he took on for Benny. But we were all in there neck deep at one time or another. So I did all the sound for the concerts that were in and around the Princeton area, and was pressed to advising on some other concerts as well. And some of the recordings that we're working on, hopefully getting released from the live concerts at Princeton over years, were ones that I can be blamed for the poor sound quality on.
I can chime in. The concerts were definitely a family affair, and I was, I think, only about 13 at the time of the first one, and they were pretty low budget. So I have a visual aid here. This was one of the initial publicity items, which I did on a mimeograph machine in middle school or something. Eventually, we got much more professional, but and much later, Ed would go out 3 or 4 times a year to the Hollywood Hills to see Benny and Hilma, either to work on something or just to visit, and I'd always tag along and got to help with recording sessions, and I guess I was a little bit of Ed's right-hand man, kind of, because it was the most fun thing I was doing, I've done my whole life. So it was a great opportunity to go to those things and read and copyright all of his, writing and scathing book reviews and various things like that. I can read one quote in Ed's words. This is from the New York Times article, which is, about I guess his career and Benny. Ed said, "The first research I did in the jazz field was working on a book on him, and I got interested in discography in general. And I was asked to do some liner notes for his album because he suggested me. And thanks to that, other people asked me to do other things for other albums. In 1987, he asked me to produce an album for him, which I had never done before. So I got into another aspect of music. And there I was suddenly in the studio with Benny Carter and Dizzy Gillespie at a session, and people are looking at me and saying, should we do another take? So he did have his own career, I guess, in library science, but all of this really did stem from Benny. And Benny gave Ed all the credit in the world too, but it was a mutual thing, like everything else.
1, 2, 3.
In the interview with Chris, Neville, and friends, a certain adjective came up, and I'm wondering if you can help to define the adjective. It's called fawning. What does fawning mean in this Bergerian context?
That Ken, you were probably the one who initiated that, if I'm not mistaken.
I may have. Well, I guess, it sort of had to do with Ed's unconditional and completely untempered and unmoderated love of jazz and all the jazz practitioners. And so, you know, I associate fawning with, you know, Ed basically at a club or any other venue where there are jazz musicians standing around the periphery somewhere in, you know, striking distance, but not too close, and just waiting for an opportunity that someone would notice him. You know, somebody needs a glass of water or they drop something, and he would just, you know, swoop in and have an interaction and of any kind. So with, you know, deference that, you know, basically far outweighed the circumstances of the occasion, typically. So, because he just, you know, he adored them.
I'll just add, Lauren, that as a fourth Berger brother, I'm surprised you have to even ask the question what that means.
thank you so much for being here this year for this concert. We hope to see you again next year, and we hope that the concert will be live next year. I also want to particularly thank the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, which has contributed so much to the creation of this particular concert series.